Sam Raimi's Spider-Man is Twilight for boys. What do I mean by that? Good question, man that lives inside of my head. Both Twilight and Spider-Man are wish fulfillment narratives that star passive protagonists that are designed to be as relatable as possible to as wide of an audience as possible, which essentially translates into being very bland. Both movies introduce us to a character who is either loved or hated by everyone in their high school, a status which is thrust upon them regardless of any action they have taken or character flaws they might have. Then an element of supernatural wish fulfillment is unceremoniously thrust upon them. Peter is bitten by a spider, which gives him superpowers, and Bella is imprinted on by a sexy vampire boy. Both teenagers spend a sequence enjoying the boons of their newfound situation, going on vampire dates and climbing trees and beating up bullies and making out with Kirsten Dunst. Then a villain shows up and declares his intention to fuck with the protagonist, something that he has no real motivation to do other than the script telling him to. The villain forces the hero into a final confrontation by threatening their loved ones, the hero gets beaten to a pulp, and then the villain gets killed through circumstances outside of the hero's control. The respective protagonists of Twilight and Spider-Man make one big decision each, in both cases in the first act. Peter chooses to become Spider-Man, and Bella chooses to investigate Edward. In both cases, these moments are basically character development cul-de-sacs. Bella independently forms the hypothesis that Edward is a vampire and tracks down pieces of town history that may shed light on the secrets of Forks, Washington, but the whole investigation becomes moot when Edward just reveals himself to her and tells her everything she wants to know about his family and vampires as a whole. Bella's curiosity and talents as a detective are not character traits that the movie has any interest in developing or exploring, so the entire little episode is irrelevant to her arc. Peter's selfishness gets his uncle killed, so he decides to become a superhero, but selfishness was never really a character trait that he had beforehand, and it's never brought up again afterward. He just develops this previously undiscussed character flaw, experiences a consequence for it, and then decides to stop having it 5 minutes later. Both of these sequences are important to the plots of their narratives, but their removal would have no effect on the development of the protagonists. The events act as catalysts for what would otherwise be difficult to justify changes in the protagonists' lives, but both Bella and Peter are essentially the same people after making these decisions as they were beforehand. Outside of this brief burst of activeness, both of them are passive playthings at the mercy of their plots. By passive, I don't mean idle. Peter and Bella still do stuff for the entirety of their respective movies, but those actions aren't really decisions, they're reactions to situations in which they have few to no options. Let's look at the incident that gets each of them involved with their main antagonist. Bella goes to a baseball game that her vampire boyfriend invited her to, where she meets a bad vampire that decides he wants to eat her, which, sure, is technically a decision, but the alternative is just staying home. Her going to the baseball game is in line with everything we already know about her at this point, so her decision to do so is unsurprising and neither develops or reveals her character. All we learn from this decision is that Bella likes spending time with Edward, which we already knew, so we aren't defining Bella's personality any further than it already is. And because this decision is not a deviation from what we know, it isn't representative of growth or development on her part either. Peter tries to stop the Green Goblin from attacking a parade and saves MJ, which again is technically a decision he makes, but in this case the alternative was running away and letting everyone die. We already know that Peter is a nice guy who likes hitting bad guys and has a crush on MJ, and this decision doesn't tell us anything more than that or develop his character beyond that point. Our two protagonists aren't making proactive, character-defining decisions, they're just reacting as the plot happens around them and taking what is essentially the only option they're given. Narratively, these events aren't really choices, and our protagonist's reactions to them, while they may involve a lot of jumping around, are passive. This passivity causes a disconnect between character and plot. Both movies have some semblance of act structure and follow the rising action of a story arc, but because the characters' decisions are reactions to outside forces, character development cannot act as the skeleton for that story. There's a lot of different ways to look at act structure, but a pretty basic one is assessment, development, and testing. The first act shows us where the protagonist is starting from, like an assessment you take at the beginning of a university course. We learn about their worldview, emotional issues, goals, and character flaws.
You graduated high school when you were 13, and this is what you're doing?
The second act introduces an outside element into their world, the inciting incident.
Someone has to help.
This forces the protagonist to learn, confront their flaws, and grow beyond where they started from. Then the third act forces them into a situation where this development is questioned. Everything they learned in the second act is put to the test. They're faced with a challenge that they wouldn't have been able to overcome had they not gone through character development, and they must put aside their doubts and reaffirm everything they've learned to overcome it.
The portal is destabilizing. You'll never make it.
She's alive in there. Someone has to help.
But Bella and Peter are passive. They're essentially the same people at the end of the first act as they are at the beginning of the third. They can't support this kind of act structure, so the screenplay has to find a way to do it without them. The stories still escalate in their pacing and level of danger, but because this escalation isn't running parallel to the protagonist's development, the characters feel disconnected, as if they're just along for the ride in their own movie. They don't do things, things happen to them. So what cog in the mechanics of the story caused them to end up this way? If we compare Twilight and Spider-Man, maybe we can find the common denominator that's causing the passiveness. Maybe you already noticed it. In both movies, none of the supporting cast have any motivation to be doing the things that they're doing, outside of the way it will affect the main character, including the main antagonists. Which means the protagonists don't have anything to do. The bad guy's evil plan in both movies revolves around trying to kill them, so all they have to do is wait around for them to show up. Like, I know the Green Goblin's initial motivation is to kill his board of directors, but he actually succeeds in doing that, halfway through the movie in a horrifying shot that gave me nightmares as a kid. This action isn't the first step in some bigger plan, it's the endgame. He's done, he's won already, and then he decides that Spider-Man is his sworn enemy now, even though Spider-Man did very little to stop him. His goal is now the totally unmotivated destruction of the protagonist in a way that also avoids motivating the protagonist to act proactively. Peter doesn't have to track the goblin down or figure out what he wants, he's always just reacting to the latest attempt to hurt him. And since they don't really have a choice about whether or not to fight a villain who's actively trying to kill them, this doesn't test their character. Peter defending himself against a lunatic in a goblin costume doesn't really tell us anything about him as a person. Not wanting to die isn't exactly a dynamic character trait. If the villain had some motivation outside of them, and maybe a non-protagonist related evil plan to go with it, our hero would have to actually get up and do something, maybe investigate what said plan is and find a way to stop it, and in doing so, make actual choices. This is also a problem with the rest of the supporting cast. I think it'll be obvious to most people why having all of your characters be head over heels in love with your protagonist for no reason is immature writing, but having all of your characters hate your protagonist for no reason is also immature writing. If the protagonist's actions have no effect on what's happening to them, you lose any opportunities for growth or development. Peter isn't being treated this way because of some inherent character flaw that he needs to overcome over the course of the movie. People are just being jerks to him. Both of these are ways of writing protagonists that don't have any significant flaws, and therefore have nowhere to develop from. Everyone loves Bella, so she's flawless. Everyone who's mean to Peter is doing it for absolutely no reason, so he's also flawless. I'm not trying to blame victims of bullying for their own abuse here. There are certainly people who are treated badly for no reason in real life. But in the context of a narrative, the protagonist is expected to confront their flaws in order to solve their problems, and so if being bullied by everyone he meets is presented as Peter's problem, it's up to the screenwriters to find a way to have that motivate some kind of growth or action on his part. And they don't, so this rather prominent element of the story ends up just being pointless window dressing. Take J. Jonah Jameson, for example. A newspaper editor is heavily criticizing Spider-Man and painting him as a menace to society. Hey, what if this guy had a real motivation for attacking him? What if he was actually making real legitimate criticisms of the way Peter was acting that reflected his central character flaw and prompted our protagonist to self-reflect and grow as a person? Maybe these criticisms could tie into the central theme of responsibility and reinforce the spine of the story. But no, he's just slandering him.
Slander is spoken. In print, it's libel.
For the same reason Flash was beating him up, and for the same reason that the Goblin was messing with him. The script told him to. He's just an angry straw man, so Peter can just ignore him and remain the same unchanged, flawless protagonist he started out as.
You are amazing.
Some people don't think so.
But you are.
Nice to have a fan.
Spider-Man's narrative isn't about solving problems and growing as a person, it's about a person who's good and deserving from the outset, having to deal with a series of unfair obstacles that were placed in his path entirely out of malice. Because everyone else in the movie is just a one-dimensional cardboard cutout of a person, Peter is left with no one to learn from, or relate to, or compare himself to, which leaves him unable to self-criticize or reflect on his actions or change. And why would he change? His actions have zero effect on the way he's treated. If he has no agency, nothing he does matters, so development would be a fool's errand. Stories aren't just a bunch of stuff happening, they're defined by cause and effect, and if there's no causal relationship between Peter's behavior and everyone else's, then we don't really have a story. We just have a bunch of people doing things. For a movie whose tagline is about the importance of responsibility, Peter isn't actually responsible for any of the stuff that happens to him. He's purely reactive. This means that the subtext of this movie is in direct contradiction with its text. In criticism, text refers to what a movie or play or essay or book is literally saying in plain English, or French or Cantonese or whatever, like how Love, Simon basically turns to the camera and says, "Hey, stop being homophobic." Subtext refers to the ideas, themes, or morals indirectly implied through the events of the story. This can be intentional, like how Lily and Lana Wachowski inserted heavy undertones of transgender identity and coming out into the Matrix.
My name is Neo.
Or unintentional, like how raging homophobe Butch Hartman keeps accidentally making narratives that are heavily queer-coded. There isn't really anything wrong with directly communicating the themes of your work through the text. Having a character sum up the unifying idea of the events on screen can clarify ambiguities about the author's intentions, or provide a unique perspective on the events of a narrative that wouldn't be immediately obvious to the audience if they were viewed without commentary. But there's a problem when the text and subtext are in direct contradiction with each other. When the movie says, "With great power comes great responsibility," but shows us a world where power gets us everything we want and we aren't responsible for the bad things that happen to us. Every misfortune that befalls Peter is the result of deliberate, unmotivated malice or contrived coincidence, and every good thing that happens to him is the result of him using his newfound strength against other people. The characters and events that make up the universe of 2002's Spider-Man are not in any sense of the word realistic, but they are an incredibly realistic reflection of how a certain type of person views the world and people around them. Remember those daydreams you had in grade school where bad guys would burst into your classroom and you'd beat them all up and say a cool one-liner and save your crush and kiss her and everyone would clap? Or your bullies would try to mess with you and you'd mop the floor with them and do a cool backflip and everyone would think you're really great? Don't lie, I know every scrawny nerd fantasized about that because I was one and I did too. This movie is like a multi-million-dollar adaptation of that fantasy. The whole selling point is Peter is you, you're a nerd, people pick on you, girls don't notice you, but what if you could change all that? The sinister thing about this daydream is that while on the surface it looks like a hero fantasy, it's actually kind of a revenge fantasy. It taps into the desire to show up everyone who's ever looked down on you. It's based on a juvenile need to get even with everyone who's ever hurt you and gain the respect of your peers. The world it creates validates this immature, self-serving perspective, this reductive view of other people. Everyone is just out to get you, so getting revenge on them is actually heroic. There's a rather relevant quote from Raylan Givens on the show Justified.
You ever hear the saying, you run into an asshole in the morning, you ran into an asshole? You run into assholes all day, you're the asshole.
The lack of motivation for the supporting characters is a symptom of the movie feeding into this existing desire. Because these self-indulgent fantasies require you to view yourself as a victim, unjustly targeted and shunned for no fault of your own by fundamentally bad people. And it's hard to do that if you're aware of the interiorities of your perceived enemies. If you are aware of the motivations and desires and anxieties and traumas of all the people who've ever inconvenienced you, if you view them as anything but one-dimensional monsters that exist to torment you, it makes it a lot more difficult to paint hurting them as heroic. If you realize that the girl you have a crush on is actually a three-dimensional person and not just a prize to win, you might realize how unrealistic and creepy it is to fantasize about her falling in love with you because you beat up a bunch of bad guys. As we discussed, three-dimensional supporting characters foster character development for the protagonist. But if Tobey Maguire's Peter developed and matured and became a better, more responsible person, the movie would be telling all of the audience members who related to Peter in the first act that they were flawed people with self-serving desires, and that wouldn't be very good marketing. You don't sell the most popular boys' Halloween costume of 2002 by telling kids that their desire to dress up as Spider-Man is based on selfishness. At best, the incongruity between subtext and text will make for a less engaging viewing experience. But at worst, the text will justify the subtext in the minds of its target audience. Hey, maybe beating up people I don't like and making my crush fall in love with me is actually selfless heroism. Best case scenario is you get a harmless popcorn flick that you don't really think too hard about. Worst case scenario is you convince a bunch of tweenage boys that self-indulgent redemptive violence is heroic, actually. It's hard to talk about the lost potential of a work since most of your critique is hypothetical, discussing what it's not doing rather than what it is doing. I mean, if only there was a movie we could compare it to that hit a lot of similar plot beats, but whose supporting cast was three-dimensional and whose narrative actually developed its protagonist in an interesting way so that we could see how these story elements interacted and affected each other and how a three-dimensional supporting cast fosters character development. Oh, wait, that exists, and it's called The Amazing Spider-Man. The Amazing Spider-Man hits a lot of superficially similar plot beats to its predecessor, but there's some key changes that fundamentally rewrite the structural DNA of the story. The movie's primary antagonist has a consistent motivation that is not related to the protagonist from his introduction until his defeat, which means that this Peter has to actively go looking for him and find ways to stop him, presenting him with dilemmas and choices that test and define his character. But this movie takes it a step further by having the villain's motivations reflect the hero's. See, Peter's motivation is clearly established at the beginning of the movie. He wants to help people, but he's facing the obstacle that he lacks the power to do so. We also see his flaws demonstrated. He's bitter and angry after being abandoned by his parents and feels that the world somehow owes him recompense. These motivations and flaws prove to be a dangerous mixture after he's given superpowers and Uncle Ben dies. He goes on an angry spree of violence that he's justified to himself as being heroism. He's looking for revenge, but convinced himself he's helping people. Curt Connors is also motivated by a desire to help people, but stopped by the red tape and bureaucracy that stand in the way of his idealism.
The Ganali device.
Yeah, I remember a picture of that in my dad's office.
The idea was so simple. You load it with an antigen, it creates a cloud which can be dispersed over a neighborhood, even an entire city. Theoretically, you could cure polio in an afternoon.
It's incredible.
Well, others disagreed. What if the device were loaded with a toxin? What if you wanted to opt out? You can't run away from a cloud after all, so here it lies, gathering dust.
He also feels cheated by life between not having an arm and being at the mercy of the demands of unethical management. After he mutates himself into a terrifying lizard man, these flaws and motivations lead him to go on a rampage on the Williamsburg Bridge, chasing down the executive that took his research and putting a lot of innocent people in danger in the process. It's at this point that the two character arcs meet. Two characters that have, up until this moment, been acting on nearly identical motivations and flaws. And here, Peter is presented with a choice, clearly demonstrated in this shot. Fight the lizard, giving in to the immature desire for violence that has been motivating his crime fighting, or save someone's life. He chooses the latter, developing past the antagonist he hasn't quite met yet. This is actually the first time in the movie Peter calls himself Spider-Man. His origin story doesn't end when he puts the costume on. He doesn't get to be a superhero until he's grown as a person. Now for the rest of the movie, Peter is facing a reflection of his pre-character development self, and spends the final act of the film testing his new morals and worldview against his old ones. The lizard's big plan is to forcibly infect New York with lizard formula to eradicate weakness.
I spent my life as a scientist trying to create a world without weakness, without outcasts.
It is on some level motivated by a desire to do good, but it's more about getting even with the world and proving his doubters wrong than actually helping anyone. Part of the reason this development was able to occur naturally was because Webb made sure to give everyone else motivations as well. Captain Stacy is this movie's analog for J. Jonah Jameson, but unlike his counterpart, he actually has some pretty fair criticisms of Spider-Man.
I think he stands for what you stand for, sir. Protecting innocent people from bad guys.
I stand for law and order, son. That's what I stand for, okay? I wear a badge. This guy wears a mask like an outlaw. He's hunting down a bunch of criminals that all look the same, like he's got some sort of personal vendetta. But he's not protecting innocent people, Mr. Parker.
And it's these criticisms that allow Peter to self-reflect and grow into the superhero we know and love. If Captain Stacy was just an unmotivated straw man, Peter wouldn't have anywhere to go. Flash also parallels him to a lesser extent than Dr. Connors. It's implied that Flash's motivation for, his terrible personality is the same as Peter's motivation for his second act rampage. We get this almost sweet moment where Peter snaps and slams Flash against a locker, and Flash actually encourages him to let his anger out.
Feels better, right?
Flash, the guy who's been nothing but a shitheel to everyone around him, empathizes with what Peter is feeling.
Look, your uncle died. I'm sorry. I get it.
Because it's implied that he's feeling something similar, and he's been dealing with it in the same way. The point of humanizing Flash is not to justify his terrible behavior, but to point out that bad behavior comes from human sources. If the people that are cruel to us are acting on the same feelings of inadequacy and anger that we share, it forces us to face the reality that we are capable of the same cruelty. And certain behavior that we might feel is empowering to us can really hurt other people. The screenwriters went to the trouble to humanize this supporting character, and as a result, our protagonist becomes more fleshed out and three-dimensional. Because the antagonist and Spider-Man are unmotivated, there's a clear, unbreakable line of distinction drawn between bad guys and good guys. Bad guys do bad things because they're bad, and if you're not a bad guy, then there's no need to worry about ever being bad. The worst thing Peter is capable of doing in this world is being a little selfish. Because bad people in this universe have no motivation for doing bad things, there isn't any danger of Peter's motivations leading him to do bad things. There's no need to look inward. As long as you don't have a handlebar mustache and a burning desire to tie damsels to train tracks, you're probably a good person.
Deliver us!
Finish it! Finish it!
Evil!
Gray areas and moral ambiguities aren't necessary for telling a good story, but if the theme of your story is responsibility and you remove any possibility of the protagonist being a less than good person, you kind of shoot yourself in the foot when it comes to exploring that idea in any meaningful way. It's kind of difficult to tell Sam Raimi that he was wrong for making a movie this way because Spider-Man was wildly financially successful. And I don't think that success was in spite of everything I've talked about, it was because of it. Both Twilight and Spider-Man made a lot of money and had massive cultural impact by uncritically indulging the most self-serving adolescent fantasies of their target demographics. Bella and Peter's lack of personality meant audiences could project themselves onto them and live vicariously in the fantasy daydreams that they provided. The lack of criticism and character development that the story world created allowed them to indulge in those fantasies without being forced to reflect on why they were so attractive. Which is not to say that these movies are bad or without value. They're fundamentally wish fulfillment, but they're very well crafted wish fulfillment. I mean, you can hate on Twilight all you want, but there's a reason it was successful and Beastly and Red Riding Hood weren't. Both of them have a lot of interesting ideas and some pretty creative filmmaking, and both movies are currently experiencing something of a renaissance, a sudden renewed interest from people who grew up with them, revisiting the nostalgia of their cultural impact. There isn't anything wrong with self-indulgence, but the pieces of media that are important to us on some level inform who we are as people. They shape the way we view the world and the people around us. And so being critical of them is an important step to criticizing our own behavior. And as I've spent the last 20 minutes belaboring, if we can't self-criticize, we can't grow as people. The main point of this video was just to use these movies as a device to discuss the mechanics of storytelling, how character motivation influences character development, how character development influences act structure, and how act structure influences theme. Comparing movies that hit a lot of similar beats made it easier to demonstrate the causal relationship between these elements than it would have been had I discussed a single movie in a vacuum. It's hard to talk about any of these story elements individually without oversimplifying them, because they're all reliant on each other, tangled together in a big web. Hey, you just spent 20 minutes listening to me talk about Spider-Man. If you made it this far, maybe show your appreciation by putting all of your money in an envelope and mailing it to me. Or just hitting the subscribe button. Either one. It's up to you.